Hi, everyone. Welcome to Talking Data Equity. We are very, very happy that you have joined us today. It is Friday, February 7th, and my name is Heather Kraus. I'm a mathematical statistician, and I'm the founder of an organization called We All Count, which specializes in building tools and doing projects that help anybody that is working with a quantitative data project align that evidence generation process with the purpose and priorities of the project. And frankly, the very favorite thing that I get to do every week is this Talking Data Equity is, excuse me, an informal gathering that we host most Fridays where anybody from any country, any sector, any level of technical ability that's interested in doing the practical work of figuring out how to align your quantitative projects with those projects' priorities and values can come and ask questions, learn new techniques, and get some inspiration and feel reminded that you are not doing this alone. And boy, oh boy, do we need that this week, eh? It's been a very long week for anybody that works with data, anybody that cares about equity and data. Our hearts absolutely go out to all our friends and colleagues in the United States. I don't think anybody here hasn't been both personally and professionally affected by what is going on. And I just wanted to point you in the direction before I introduce our special guest of our community data equity forum. I'm putting the link to that in the chat right now. That forum is where the recording from today's Talking Data Equity will go. And it is also the place where you can go to ask questions. There are already some very active threads in there about where to find some data that you're used to using that might be missing right now. Tons and tons of people have anticipated this situation, and there are lots of workarounds and solutions. So, for emotional reasons or technical reasons or value based reasons, feel free to pop into that forum and ask questions, connect with others, look for resources. It is not a membership site. You do not have to pay to join, it's public good. And we are in there every day. So, please go ahead and use that. Now, for today, we have a very, very timely special guest. We have a special guest, Michael Corey, who is I'm going to introduce in just a second. And while Michael is sharing his slides and his stories and his examples, we are going to ask that you stay with your microphones turned off. You can have your videos on or off, but during the slide presentation, we ask that you have your microphones turned off. Feel free to have conversations in the chat. We have the Zoom chat set up so that you can ask questions and make comments with that Zoom drop-down menu set to everyone, which means everybody who's here or anybody that watches the recording will see your conversation. Or if you want to ask a question or make a comment privately to me, you can use my name in that drop-down menu, Heather Kraus. And then I'll do my best to amplify your question during the question and answer period, but I won't attach your name to it. And I can't promise to get to all the questions because often we have too many, but there's always an opportunity to take the questions we didn't get to and move them on over to the forum. Okay, enough talking from me. Let me introduce you to our special guest, who I have known for quite a while at a distance, known and admired. And I'm very excited to have them joining in person. Michael Corey is a geospatial technical data lead and the associate director for Mapping Prejudice. Before transitioning to public history, Michael spent 20 years as a journalist and a data journalist at the Star Tribune, Reveal for the Center for the Investigative Reporting, and the Des Moines Register. And if you're not in the data journalism world, you might not know that those are basically the three coolest places that you could
Oh,
say you worked.
thanks, Heather.
His, his previous work has spanned zoning, segregation, mortgage disparities, the US Mexico border fence system, human induced earthquakes, and sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. So you can see that this is well timed. Thank you, Michael, for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Heather. Everyone can hear me, right? We're good. Okay. Great. It's great to see you all. Thank you so much. And yeah, I've been seeing Heather's name in the NICAR listserv but since back in the day, the old school listserv. Yeah, and it's always great to be in conversation about this topic. But I mean, especially this week, it's just I know that like I have a lot I want to talk about, and I'm sure you do too. So I will try to make this a good discussion. And thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about the work of Mapping Prejudice. Mapping Prejudice was founded in 2016, so right on the eve of the previous Trump administration, at the University of Minnesota Libraries by a team of historians, librarians, and technologists. I've been with the project for 2.5 years, and as Heather said, before that, I was a data journalist for 20 years before that. And it's funny that this job, I still feel like I'm essentially a data journalist. I don't feel like there's very much difference between doing good public history, except especially the kind of public history that we do that is so data driven. There's not much difference between that and the job I was doing before. Data journalists are very used to negotiating for public records and then turning a pile of sort of record soup into structured data and something intelligible, and then telling a story about it. Um, so, okay, what is a covenant for? So primarily our what we're mainly known for is we've identify and map racial covenants. And so what is a covenant, first of all? And I'll say that like this, the context of this is going to be primarily the United States. We know that there are racial covenants in Canada. We've heard that there's some in other like British Commonwealth, former territories. But the context in different countries is somewhat different. But in the United States, a covenant is a provision in a property sale that limits the buyer's use of the property in some way. And a covenant often, quote, runs with the land, meaning that it's something that is binding on future buyers as well. So if I buy a house from somebody and there's a covenant on it, that's not just binding on me, that is binding on the next person who buys the house and the next person who buys the house. And so they can often go on for a very long time. I think technically, I don't think it's legal to do them in perpetuity, but but it is another important thing to note is that not all restrictive covenants are racial covenants, and so people sometimes confuse restrictive covenants and racial covenants. But restrictive covenants is just that's a covenant, any kind of covenant, and many types of covenants are still legal, and it's everything from how far back is the house going to be set from the road, what type of materials the building use, but a very common type of covenant in the 20th century and to some extent in the 19th century in the United States was a racial covenant. And I just want to give a warning that we're going to show some racial covenants here as examples, and there is some racist and outdated language coming up in the next slides because we think it's important to like actually show the language here because the language is quite explicit. And so at any point in time, like if you need to duck out, do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Totally fine. I can't see you anyway, so but do what you got to do to take care of yourself. But just know that we're going to talk about this stuff today. So racial covenants appear in a wide range of property documents, but most often in deeds, property deeds when a house is bought or sold. And this is an example. From Minneapolis. This is from 1910, and it says that the property shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. And descent is spelled wrong in the document. Um, and so, like I said, this language is quite explicit. The intent of this language is quite explicit, and we see some racial categories that are pretty intelligible to us today, and some other ones that seem pretty outdated or might even be confusing. Like what's going on with the word Mongolian there, for example, is um, and racial covenants are a product of this like 19th century and early 20th century race science idea that categorized people into sort of like these overarching races. And so Mongolian almost certainly refers to Asian people. Asian people are very often targeted by racial covenants, but particularly in Minnesota, this is a little ambiguous because Native Americans also could be grouped into a Mongolian category in this like race science idea. So this covenant may also be referring to Native American people. But we see other things here like what like Moorish people, Turkish people, what's going on there? And I think and particularly in this audience, I can talk about this a little bit more. I think it's really important that we be careful about how we interpret these racial categories because it's not always clear what they were thinking. And I think racial covenants are a great example of like how racial categories are really, I mean, they're really they move and they change all the time, like in the same way that whiteness changes, who counts as black changes, um, and I think that's a running theme that we'll talk about today. So here's another example. This one is from Benton County, which is in St. Cloud, Minnesota. This one's dated 1941, although it might be a repeat from earlier. And this one was found by College of St. Benedict professor Brittany Merritt and her students. And this says, said premises shall not be sold, leased, or rented or occupied by any person of the Negro, Oriental, Semitic, or Indian races, or who has the blood of any said races, except as limited by present laws or treaties. And so here we see Native Americans specifically targeted, as well as Jewish people. And the basically every covenant that anyone has ever found in the United States, with like literally the exception of like one or two, targets black people. And so it's important to note that the overarching target or the overwhelming target of racial covenants is black people. But we also see Asian people, Jewish people, very commonly targeted by these. Um, Here's another one. No persons of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. And this covenant was actually, this is from Richfield, Minnesota. This one was put in place in 1946, the year after World War II ended. Someone still felt comfortable in Minnesota putting the word Aryan in a document. And I think that's very interesting. And then one more covenant example before I move on here. This one is from 1919. This is from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and it says simply, said premises shall never be occupied by a colored person. And this is the racial covenant that is on my parents' house. And I want to talk a little bit about the way I first learned about this and how we interpreted it, because I think that has really helped me guide some of the work that I do today. And so I found out about this when I was about 12 years old, and my parents refinanced the mortgage. And I'm not really sure if like they saw it or like the mortgage broker saw it and pointed out, but they said, hey, they told us kids, like, hey, did you know there's this crazy thing in our property record that says a black person can never own this house? And my reaction at the time was, well, what a strange thing. Like, why? There's not even any black people here. And I did not make any connection in my head that this document might have something to do with the fact that there were not only very, very few non-white people in my neighborhood, there were very, very few white people, or there were very few non-white people in my town. And Eau Claire had 60,000 people. I don't have my stat in the slides here, but still, like when I lived there, like it was still like an overwhelmingly white place. And to me, like the lesson of this is that covenants were so successful in places like my hometown that I couldn't even conceive of a different type of neighborhood where everyone didn't look like me and everyone didn't have the same kind of house as me. And so I think that's a measure of how successful these technologies of segregation were in so many places. But what I didn't know, and what my parents didn't know either, because they didn't have the context, is that it wasn't just my house. It wasn't just some one-off weird thing in our deed. It was most likely every property in our neighborhood. And this is our map showing the Twin Cities that we've mapped so far. Up in the top right, you can see the date of that the covenant was put into place. So it wasn't just my neighborhood. It's large swaths of the Twin Cities, and it's large swaths of every city in America that are reserved for the exclusive use of white people. And we've now mapped, I think, what are we up to? Like 30,000 plus covenants in the Twin Cities, and well, I have a number later on, but like these things are very widespread. And really, anytime anyone has looked in a community where there was development at this time period, they're going to find racial covenants. They're in every city in America that existed at that time. But why should we still care? Racial covenants were made fully illegal in 1968. They were ruled unenforceable in 1948 in the United States, but people still put them in well after 1948. But that's at minimum 50 years ago. And part of the reason is that that's not that long ago. That's well within my parents' memory. But people do say all the time, it's like, well, that was so long ago. But as I think everyone on this call knows, racial covenants are not the only game in town. Racial covenants are part of this long history of segregation and displacement and exclusion that stretches through all of American history. And racial covenants occupy this period of overt legal segregation that is also There, you also have like ordinances that are just racial zoning that are ruled unconstitutional. You have exclusionary zoning of other types. You have redlining. You have mortgage discrimination. You have blockbusting. You have the freeways coming through. Um, but even after 1968, these things sort of go forward, and even to the extent that it is now illegal to have this overt segregation in your deeds. Those patterns that were laid down by the racial covenants are very much still in play. Like the areas of the Twin Cities that had racial covenants are still the whitest placed parts of the Twin Cities today. That's not true in every city, interestingly enough, but in the Twin Cities that is certainly true. Also today, Twin Cities metro home ownership, 75% of white families own their home, only 33% of black families own their home. That's the largest gap in the country. And why is that? Why does that persist to this day? And nationwide, the black ownership rate does seem to be moving up a little bit over the last few years. But black home ownership is still about the same as 1968. So that's why this still matters. And we know from the data that we produce, other researchers can use that data to do other really interesting analyses. And so this is research by Dr. Arad Yassoud and my predecessor in my job, Kevin Erman Solberg. And this shows that they showed that in 2019, covenanted homes in Minneapolis were still worth 15% more than non-covenanted houses. And houses that were redlined were worth 25% less than the median home value. It's really important when we're talking about these things to note that this works in both directions. BIPOC people are disadvantaged by being restricted to redline neighborhoods, but white people gained and continue to enjoy financial advantages from living in these neighborhoods. And so for me, there's a covenant on my parents' house. Someday I will either inherit that house and sell it, or they will sell it. And our research suggests that they will make a premium off of the fact that there is a covenant on this house. Not because anyone knows that the covenant's there or because they want to live in a segregated neighborhood, but because what we have decided makes a valuable neighborhood comes from this era of racial covenants. So research like I just showed you that Dr. Sood did is only possible because of the very granular data that our process produces. And if you want, you can look at our data. We publish all of it on GitHub. And we're very careful that every county has the same set of fields in a very machine readable, geospatial, and tabular formats. People in the past have generally known where some covenants are. Realtors, like it was their business to know where these things were. But by being a lot more precise, we can understand these historical processes better. And then we can power all these different kinds of secondary analysis, like that paper. And this data is used widely by historians, economists, city planners, federal housing officials. As some of you may know, Minneapolis, as well as some other cities, got rid of single family zoning a number of years ago, and the racial covenants data was one of the major justifications we've been told for how to implement that. So how do we get our data? We get digitized images of property records, which are usually like scanned microfilm. Most counties have not OCR'd their data yet, although increasingly that's starting to happen. So when we get a pile of documents, we upload them to our cloud platform where we do a number of things. We OCR them using Amazon Textract, and then we search for terms associated with racial covenants. Then once we have those hits, we upload those hits to a platform called Zooniverse, which is a crowdsourcing platform. And then we ask them a series of questions. They'll confirm yes or no. Is this a covenant? Like, does the word white here refer to the white race or White Bear Lake, which is a city in Minnesota? And white, that we don't use just the term white. That'd be a little naive. But if I say other terms, it gets a little bit more problematic. But so they answer like yes or no, this is a covenant. They transcribe the text of the covenant, transcribe the buyer, the seller, the date, and then the property identifying information, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Like because it seems crazy, it seems crazy to me that like they don't put addresses on these property records. They never have, and so we don't know where in space these things are located without doing some additional matching. And so we show each of those hits that we have to five separate volunteers. And why do we do that? That seems crazy. We do that because we're able to then compare all of their answers to each other. So if five of the five say that yes, this is a covenant, we're very confident that this is a covenant. We don't have to double check that. If five of the five say the date is X, then we know the date is X. It's quite difficult to vandalize the platform. I want to knock on wood because but no one's really figured out how to vandalize it yet because we show people these things in random order. And so this is how we handle the scale that we're working at, because we're working at the scale of like maybe tens of thousands of hits per county, and there's just no way that we can manually check everything. And then finally, once we've gotten that data back, we put them on a map. So today we've processed 14 million pages across 11 counties. We're about to do, I think, 4 million more, and so like we're growing all the time. We've mapped over 60,000 racial covenants across the country. We've had over 11,000 volunteers, and we use the term community map makers for our volunteers who have contributed to this process, and that's I think that's an incredible achievement. That 11,000 people, including I saw Leo on the call, has spent some time transcribing records. That's over 51,000 volunteer hours. And we're today in conversation with over 30 counties across 10 states and DC about bringing that work to them. So why crowdsourcing? Why do we do that with crowdsourcing? One, it's just more accurate. I mean, even if we could have someone look at every one of those records, like we have, I believe we have the world's best property researcher on our team, Penny Peterson. But even Penny would be the first to say even she makes mistakes. And so by using the crowdsourcing, and comparing each other's answers, we're getting a lot more error checking than what we get otherwise. We also don't have 300 graduate assistants, although and I didn't update this number, but we do have 11,000 volunteers. And so the way this looks is that when people on the ground are doing the community engagement, which is a really important part of our process to get people to come to our community map making sessions, we get through these things. I mean, and so Milwaukee, we generally have been doing about 200 to 700 transcriptions per day. Washtenaw County, which I know Leo was working in, I just looked the other day and my eyes popped out because they had 1,000 in one day from 3 different events. And at our peak in 2020, which was right after the murder of George Floyd, people really were just looking for something to do that felt positive. And so we were doing 2,000 transcriptions a day at that point. And so we do get through these records. We actually don't list our project in the public list of Zooniverse projects because we feel that if we did that, we would actually get through them too fast. And we think it's really important that people in the communities that we're working with are getting the chance to do these deeds. And so we think it's really important to not just put that into like the general like citizen science world, because they will get through it. But I think, there's really something about the experience of seeing records in your community that we think is really important. And we do our crowdsourcing via our weekly Zoom sessions, which, like I said, we call community map making sessions. And we train our community map makers, explaining why this is important. And originally, the idea of the project was just get people in front of these primary sources and get through all the data and make the map. And at first, we did these in person, but when the pandemic hit, we were forced to try Zoom out. And I think I wasn't there, but like but people were very concerned about, are we going to be able to replicate the experience? And what we actually found is it works much better. There's fewer technical challenges. It's more accessible for people who either can't get to a venue or don't want to get to a particular venue. People can be as visible or as low profile as they want to be with their video settings. We don't have to figure out laptops and Wi-Fi, which is a huge problem if you want to do these things. But we also found, most importantly, that the conversations people were having with each other in these Zoom sessions were really powerful. And this led us to what is now our number one guiding principle, which is the process is the product. And when we started, we assumed that getting to the finished map was the goal. But we have seen that the map has been and the map has been transformational in driving very real policy changes. But our volunteers and our other community members have taught us that mapping covenants is not the real goal. The real goal and the secret to mapping prejudice's success is the experience of absorbing new information together, talking about that, and that is what opens people up to new possibilities for reparative change. And our community map makers believe strongly and correctly that they are the owners of this data and this project. And they show up at other kinds of meetings and they say, hey, I learned about this stuff that went down in my neighborhood. And I think it's time we do things differently and try to fix some of that. And that's the power of the process. And you can see here, these are some comments that people have given us over time. Um, and so I want to talk a little bit about like technological decisions now, because like as we are doing that work and as we bring more people into the software development, we've been thinking a lot about how to make sure the process as the product stays at the center of our work. And that informs our software development priorities as well as our community engagement work. Um, and we're trying to be really clear about the fact that the purpose of our covenants research is to understand the scale and nature of racial covenants, but this should also be used to unmake those legacies. It's not just a science project, it's not just a data project. And we want to support policymaking. We're not policymakers, we're not planners, but we want to support policymaking that repairs the harm done and prevent future discrimination and segregation. And I think that that is not intuitive for a lot of academics. They're and not because of any ill will, but like they have either haven't thought that through or are not comfortable in that mode. And we understand that. But this is something that like if we're going to work with you, we need to be on the same page about that. And then second, that any technological innovation we make, and we have a very robust technical platform. I wish it was less complicated. But technological innovation should be in the service of facilitating, expanding, and improving the volunteer experience. And removing community crowdsourced volunteers from the process is completely antithetical to our goals. And so why do I say this? Because like this is the AI world now, right? Like, and we've been approached by at least one project, thankfully not at the University of Minnesota, where their pitch to us was, hey, we can use AI to solve your problem. And we thought, oh, well, we have lots of problems. You have to be more specific than that. And they said, well, you're volunteers. That's not scalable. Like, I mean, that's your weak link. Like, we can't, like, people can't possibly do this. Community engagement everywhere, and we tried to explain that we're not interested in replacing our volunteers. Like they are the project, like that, and having them have these conversations is the point of the project. And so it was interesting how from the outside, that seems like our biggest weakness, but to us, it's our biggest strength of the project. And but they see it as they saw it as a bottleneck. And I'd love to say that we convinced them and they're like on board, and but I don't think we did. And I think this is going to be an ongoing discussion. And part of what we try to tell them too is like beyond just the process as a product is that like we need to be really clear that we're talking about structural racism here. And so there are so many people who are motivated to not hear this information or not believe this information, and that changes the way we need to work because and we feel like if we color in a lot on this map and say there's a covenant there, we better be darn sure there really was a covenant there, because what happens after we or somebody else makes a map is that people want to go in and they want to discharge or disavow that covenant, which is like a document you can file against property and say, hey, there was a covenant here, I want to memorialize that, but I don't agree with that. So people want to go and they discharge their covenant. And if someone goes all through all the effort of filling that paperwork and frankly the emotional processing of this information, discovering they have this on their house, and then and then they found out, nope, it was a mistake. It really doesn't take many of those to kill all your goodwill and allow people to say, see, they're making it up. And so it just statistically good is not good enough for this kind of work. And I think again, like this is something that I brought over from journalism is like I'm kind of used to working in an environment where like, well, you better be right because someone might sue you. like and in this case, like the risk is not that someone's going to sue us, but I think again, like people are just so primed to disbelieve this information, and so we gotta come like precise and correct at all times. And this is why I love my team is because we are all on the same page about that. Um, so another reason, like on a technical level, that like AI may not be the best choice for this type of work is that property records are really hard. And I thought I knew property records, but when I was a journalist, but man, I really didn't. And so what we're looking at here is like um, this is a physical description from a document that has a covenant on it. And our volunteer crowdsourcing map makers are really good at this type of problem because the problem is here is they're going to be asked, okay, what is the lot, block, and addition of this property? Because this is how we're going to map the property. And if you look at here, it says lot numbered 5 of block 8 in the subdivision of lots 1 to 73 inclusive, excepting lots 34 and 30. Okay, so this is this is a confusing problem for a human to answer. I would argue this is nearly an impossible problem for AI to answer. And it's a great example of where there are many possible answers to this problem, but there's only one that is correct, and that requires context and additional research. Um, and when every individual property really matters, statistically good enough is not good enough for what we're doing. And but like I said, this is not just about whether new technologies can technically do a good job. We're in a moment where there is so much pressure to find the next big thing, and companies are making, and apparently governments now are making these huge bets and huge promises. based on generative AI technologies. And we're feeling that pressure at Mapping Prejudice. And when I feel that kind of pressure, I'm always reminded of this paper, which is now a website that was first published in 1999 called White Supremacy Culture, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And this is originally developed by Tema Ukun, who is a white woman. And the idea is that there are recognizable attitudes and behaviors that do not serve any of us, but sometimes counterintuitively reinforce white supremacy. And there are two that I think are particularly relevant to this technology discussion right now. One is progress is more and quantity over quality. And then this, what I'm showing here, is from the page on urgency. And to me, I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but to me, like this is so uncanny that I have to remind myself that this was not written about AI. This was written before our current era, but I think it's so important. And so when we're working on these technical problems, I would like to suggest that we always be asking, what are we trying to fix and what are we trying to scale? And who benefits from that and who loses out? And as a historian, the answer to that question is really consistent over time, who benefits and who loses. And I think, yeah, I think history has really clear lessons for this moment. And in this light, racial covenants were an innovative technology, a so-called scientific best practice, which became the standard for American property development because all the smartest people in the industry were touting them. And so, like, we use AI in our processes, and we would be foolish to not look like the ROCR is AI based, and we would be foolish to not look at each of these new technologies, and we are, but we want to use them to enhance that volunteer experience. So maybe not all 5 volunteers have to transcribe. Maybe the system can suggest the boundaries of the covenant or potential dates and lots. But we really need to study if that's going to help or hurt the real work, which is people having that experience that has mobilized thousands of people and counting. So what are we trying to scale? And at the end of each presentation, I always include like action steps and what you can do. And I used to use like a really long list, but this slide was created by my friend Maria Cisneros, who is like the coolest city attorney in the country, this for the city of Golden Valley. And it's a much shorter list, and it was originally meant for judges and court employees, but I have yet to find a audience of people with specialized skills where this is not super relevant. So what you can do, and I don't think this is new to a lot of you here, is understand historical harm and its impact on your work, ensure that everyone leaves better off, decenter systems and center people, and keep working on yourself. And so, to me, I just always keep it in the front of my mind. There is no such thing as just writing code, and there's no such thing as just making a map. Like how we do those things matters. And so we're in a critical time right now. I don't need to tell you that. This moment is scary and it's exhausting. And as I was prepping these slides, my calendar was just filling up with emergency faculty meetings, learning sessions, like union organizing sessions. And my colleagues in the library are literally rescuing the census and NIH data right now. And I have to teach a class next month on how to map census data and how are we going to teach something that will be valid a month from now. Um, and so I wanted to just bring up these two quotes. The function, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you from explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language and you spend 20 years proving you do. And so like here we find ourselves again, like in this spin cycle. And a challenge I feel really strongly right now is how to use the freedom that we still have to keep going with this work while also trying to meet a moment that is desperately trying to distract us. And I think it's really noteworthy that this type of data is being targeted. We can see why the census is being targeted. The census is a great example of concrete evidence that race and gender and sexuality are not fixed concepts, and they are certainly not simple. Um, and so we need to do both of these things. We need to not get distracted, but we need to make sure we're saving this work in these times. But we also need to stay healthy. And I've never worked out more in my life, which I am happy to say, because that's how I sleep at night. But I've also never felt more strongly that I am in the right place and we have information to share. And I think most importantly, I was talking to Heather right before we got on, people still want to hear it. I mean, at the moment that the birthright citizenship executive order came down, we were sitting in a city council meeting getting an award in a suburb that was founded as a enclave of segregation with racial covenants. They're mostly female, women of color led city council was giving us award and saying they want to make undoing some of these harms part of their work. And so whatever the government says or does, this history is not going away. And it's going to be there waiting, whether we continue to address it today or whether we have to do less and wait tomorrow. And I just want to, and I know you all do too, like, I just want to say I helped my kids hopefully have to deal with a little bit more advanced work and just keep doing what we're doing. So I will stop there. We would love to see you at an upcoming community mapping session. Thank you for all your work, and yeah, looking forward to discussing.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was exactly what we needed today. And you can see there's giant applause coming through all the ways that Zoom allows people to
Oh,
express
thank
their feelings and emotions. And so there's a lot of people very, very grateful for the work that you're doing and the fact that you held time in your calendar that is definitely filling up with emergency meetings to come and be with us.
oh, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for all the work you're doing. And I hope you're all taking care of yourself too.
Exactly. So there's a few questions in the chat, which I will highlight, but this is also your opportunity if you're in the room live with us to turn your microphone on and ask a question. So if you are in the room and you'd like to ask a question, because there's a couple hundred of us, it'll probably work best if you can raise your hand. And there's like a Zoom way to raise your hand, which is by clicking on the reaction button, which is usually some kind of like heart, and you can raise your hand that way, or you can just put in the chat that you'd like to raise your hand. If you can't do any of those things, you can turn your microphone on and ask a question.
Oh, and Heather, I realized I
Yeah.
forgot to say one thing that I meant to because I didn't say the second quote. And this is from the University of Minnesota president Rebecca Cunningham, because I do want to call out like what she wrote us this week, and she's still saying the words, and I want to give her credit for saying that
Mhm.
diversity, equity, and inclusion is ingrained in our values as a university, and it advances and elevates our mission. And so like I just want to celebrate that the president is saying the right things,
Yep.
that this work is still going to continue to be important. So I'm proud to be at an institution that is going to try to keep doing those things. So thank you, sir.
No, it's really important, I think, to raise things like that and,
Mm,
just set an example that it is possible in
mm,
this moment to do this. And it is worthwhile. So no worries.
mm.
Hey, Kelly, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we
Yep.
can hear you great.
Great. So thank you so much for the presentation. I have kind of a two-pronged question around who's being engaged with the project. I did have to step
Mhm.
away for a couple minutes, so if you already answered this, please just move on to the next question. So the first part of it is when I look at mapping prejudice and the owners who have taken action to kind of denounce the covenants on their own properties in my community, it does kind of match what I would expect in terms of who is doing that and who is not doing that. And I guess I'd love to hear your reflections on how relying on individual engagement isn't just kind of becoming a reflection of the existing racism that the system helped build in the first place. My second prong of that question is obviously the federal and local governments made a lot of these decisions in the past. The other institutions that helped with this, though, were the developers who were building these properties and, you know, putting the covenants on. And I'm just kind of curious. I've heard about the government, I've heard about the individual, and I'm wondering what engagement with the development community has been in terms of their role as important institutions in executing these racist laws.
Sure. Yeah, these are both great questions. I will try to remember both of them, but remind me if I don't. If I don't. So on the first question, I'm actually curious. Like, what do you expect for people who discharge covenants? Because I'm not actually sure what you mean. Like straight up. So, like who do you feel like you see discharging covenants?
Um, my observations would be that, and my understanding is that a current owner can kind of take action and say
Mhm.
and every new owner of that property can say, you know, we are acknowledging this and
Mhm.
saying that we do not agree with this being on our land records.
Mhm.
Um, so what I see is areas that are maybe now more progressive, or maybe the composition of the neighborhood has changed, are the ones doing some of that denouncing, and the wealthier, much more white, probably big beneficiaries of these covenants in history are not. And there's still not, I'm seeing a lot of like no action taken on some of the
Sure.
map
Yeah.
when I look at it.
Yeah, no, it's okay. So a couple things I'd say is that like one is I think like I assumed when I started this work that racial covenants are going to be on the biggest and fanciest houses, and that's actually generally not what we see. Racial covenants tended to be put on what at the time was attainable housing, so like bungalows, um like smaller post-war pre-war and post-war houses, and so um that's where you're going to find most of the covenants. But I think you're right. Like I mean, because discharge to date has been a voluntary process. It is incumbent on the individual to want to take action on that. And I think that different people who have done that process or different neighborhoods that have organized to do that process have done it for different reasons and in different and at different scales. Um, and I would argue that that is more of a feature than a bug at this point. Because and we really view discharge as a voluntary thing that people should do if if they want to. Because for us, like doing a discharge on your property does not change the fact that this neighborhood was founded as a white neighborhood. It doesn't undo any damage. These covenants are not have not been enforceable for a long time. So legally, it is not clear that discharging a covenant would add any additional legal protection. Um, and so we view discharge as a symbolic act that people should do if they feel it's meaningful. Um, we've heard from some neighborhoods that are like still very white, and they said, "Oh, thank goodness you did this work because we can discharge the covenants and then we'll be done." And then we have to come in and have another conversation and say again, like, discharging this covenant doesn't undo any of the damage, and so discharge needs to be the start of a conversation, not the end of a conversation. There are cities now that are mandating covenants discharged either all at once, like they're organizing all these efforts to discharge all their covenants, or at the point of sale the next time the house is sold. We're generally not in favor of that, which maybe is counterintuitive, because we do think that like we're trying to get people engaged in this, and if it is something that's like um, just something they have to do, I'm not sure that engagement has the same impact. I think other people might disagree with that approach, but and this is something that like I said, that city we were talking to is one of where we got the award is one of these cities that's doing that, and I was there to try to convince them not to do it, and they basically said, we hear you, but we're going to do it anyway, like because this is important. And so, I mean, I think this is like an ongoing conversation. But I will say now, as we move out of the Twin Cities, where like most cities are like you say, like I want to advance equity, they're like, okay, great, cool, we're on board with that. If you go to other communities where we would like to do this research, that is not the case, and it is already becoming an excuse that some of these counties use is like, well, if you go find these covenants, then people are going to discharge them, and then a lot of counties have waived the fee to do the discharge, and then we're going to lose revenue. And I don't think that's like a real revenue loss, but this is an excuse they use. And so like so that's we have tried to keep it voluntary. Second question. Oh yeah, developers. So some developers have engaged, some have not. I've been actually really impressed with the real estate community in particularly Minneapolis, which has again made this like one of their big priorities. There's a coalition of planners, government officials, city attorneys, realtors called Just Deeds that is organized to help have that conversation about how discharge is the start of a conversation, not the end of a conversation. And so like I do think like continuing to engage those institutions, which were involved not just in racial covenants, but also in like redlining and mortgage discrimination and steering, like that is really important. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was really, really helpful. Um, One of the questions that's come up a couple of times in the chat, Michael, is can you direct people that don't live in your state to anything similar? One of the things that we talked
Mhm.
about before we got live was how cohesive and functional the data journalism community is, and
Mhm.
that might not be the same for this particular community. There's a couple of individual links in the chat, but is there a place where people could go if they were interested?
Yes, yeah. So there are, I think, I will say at least a dozen and probably dozens of projects around the country who are doing similar work, not necessarily with the same methodology, but there's a group called the National Covenants Research Coalition. So if you Google, I'll type it here, National Covenants Research Coalition. Um, if you Google that, there's a site and you can see a list of some of the projects that are spinning up. And we're always happy to talk to groups that are interested in spinning something up. But we tell people, okay, it's going to take a couple years. You're going to have to do the community engagement, and we got to make sure your records are digitized. But if you're up for that, we are open to talking to people about expanding expanding the project.
Fantastic. That is great news. Yes, okay, great. In the past, many BIPOC people did not accurately identify to avoid racism and opportunity disparity, resulting in inaccurate race statistics. Do you feel in the current environment it may trend back to this protection method?
I mean, I don't know. I don't think
Yeah.
that I can answer that question,
No.
but yeah,
It's a
yeah.
very, very good question, though.
Mhm.
I think that the current climate is going to bring into sharp focus a lot of the embedded assumptions that
Mhm.
we've made about kind of exactly to the point that you were making. Who is this good for and why?
Mhm. Mhm.
There have been moments where collecting certain types of data have been really good for the
Mhm.
eradication or the reduction of racism. And then that same data can be used to really entrench racism. So I think we're going to have to rethink the questions that you've asked us here in relation to your data, but in relation to
Mhm.
every piece of data that we're used to having.
Well, I think if you just look at like the history of the race and ethnicity questions in the U.S. Census, like there's so much harm like
Yeah.
that's embedded
Yeah.
in those, but it's also that's what we got. And so like it is always this evolving conversation of like how do we measure these things? How do we measure progress or backsliding? As many of you know, like 2020 methodology was really different, and that was like sort of causing its own issues that like I think in a positive way, but like of continuity over time. And now I think we're all just like, well, what in the world is the 2030 census gonna look like? So.
Yeah. I hadn't really even thought about the 2030 census yet, but that's true. I will add that to the list. I just put in the chat a link to several of the conversations on the Community Data Equity Forum about places that are storing data, places where you still can
Mhm.
access the data that you're accustomed to having access to. And I really encourage you to use the forum. It's a tool where you can find people who are really actively working on this and happy to share their ideas. Is there anyone else that wants to raise their hand live and ask a question in the chat or on their microphone? I'm scanning the chat just to see we've covered most of the big questions, I think. Lots of great resources and all right. Oh, great. Lots of applause. Excellent. Okay, then I think we will leave it here so everybody could have a couple of minutes to do something nice for themselves before heading to whatever you have at the top of the hour. And having something not back to back is always what we aim to do. And we will be back next Friday. So the link is always the same. So regardless of where you are or who you're working for, you can always join us. The link does not change. It's a drop-in informal conversation. So feel welcome to come and bring your colleagues. And the fact that I've heard from a lot of you individually in the past couple of weeks that the community that Talking Data Equity is able to sustain means a lot to you. And frankly, the community is nothing without you. So you are the community. Thank you for continuing to show up. Thank you for continuing to send us fantastic suggestions for people you'd like to hear from. Keep sending them because we're keeping sending out invitations. It's a paid gig. We don't ask people for their time for free. And Michael, I I could not have thought of a better Friday
Aw.
to have you for just the combination of the data, the equity, the clarity, and the humanity. It's just a perfect example of why we can keep putting one foot in front of the other and make some progress, even if it feels like there's a lot of headwinds. I really, really appreciate it. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much, and I truly like I always feel so much better like being in these spaces, and so thank you to all of you for being here. I mean, there was like to have 250 of you in here, that makes me feel so much better, and I just think I just want us all to hold that like it's not like all the people who wanted to make this stuff better just vanished, right? I mean, we're all still here, and like we're gonna keep going, and again, like the history's not going away one way or the other, so we'll and I always feel like and history always has other ideas, so we'll see what happens next. But thank you all for being here, and yeah, I really appreciate you all.
Perfect, perfect ending. Take really good care of yourselves and each other, and we'll see you all next Friday. Bye, everybody.